A Panzer rumbles forward, its turret sweeping left and right across a shattered French hedgerow. The crew inside believes they are unstoppable. They survived artillery barrages, they outgunned British and Soviet armor, they crushed infantry formations who had nothing capable of piercing their steel. For years in this war, a German tank rolling toward a rifle squad meant one thing: the infantry died. Tracks grind over broken fences. The engine's roar echoes through the countryside. In the turret, the commander scans confidently. He knows that small arms fire cannot touch him. He knows the enemy's grenades cannot breach his armor. He knows the battlefield belongs to tanks. And then, a tiny streak of smoke. A sudden flash from a hedgerow barely 30 meters away. No artillery. No mines. No aircraft screaming overhead. Just a single American soldier kneeling in mud, with a metal tube resting on his shoulder. The German commander has a split second to react. Not enough. The rocket strikes the side armor with a violent burst of light. A shaped charge focuses its energy into a jet of metal hot enough to melt through steel. Flames erupt inside the turret. The gunner never finishes his shout. The driver slams the hatch, trapped inside as smoke fills the compartment. The crew never expected death to arrive from such a small, cheap, and ordinary-looking weapon. The tank that symbolized domination now burns from a weapon that took minutes to learn and cost only a fraction of the machine it destroyed. Radio reports spread a warning across German units. Infantry have a new weapon, a shoulder-fired tube made of simple steel and wiring, a rocket that can tear through even a Panzer's armor. It does not require strength. It does not require years of training. It does not require a team the size of a gun crew. It requires one soldier, one rocket, one chance. German crews begin noticing every bush, every trench, every ruined doorway. The battlefield becomes a place of constant anxiety. Any lone infantryman might now hold the power to turn a tank into a furnace. The Americans give this new weapon a name as plain and simple as its construction: the bazooka, a tool built quickly, built cheaply, built to give ordinary soldiers the power to stop a Panzer dead on the front line. This moment, this terrifying shift, is only the beginning of the story. Before the bazooka appeared on the battlefield, fighting a tank meant fear. It meant running. It meant watching steel monsters roll forward, while rifles and machine guns bounced harmlessly off their armor. In the early years of World War II, German panzers were often the deciding factor on the ground. During the Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939 to 1941, these armored vehicles crushed resistance across Poland, France, the Balkans, and much of the Soviet Union. Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks advanced quickly and struck hard. When soldiers heard the grinding tracks approaching, they knew trouble followed. Infantry caught in the open stood no chance. Anti-tank guns existed, but they were heavy, slow to move, and easy targets if spotted. Mines helped, but placing them required risky, close-quarters movement under fire. American forces, still preparing for major combat early in the war, saw how devastating German armor could be. They knew that when the United States eventually joined the fight, infantry units needed something powerful and portable, something a single soldier could use to stop a tank. At that time, the U.S. Army's primary anti-tank weapons for infantry were outdated rifles, firing special armor-piercing ammunition, and improvised explosives that required dangerous proximity. Troops were told to aim for vulnerable points like tracks or rear armor, but getting that close meant risking death before throwing anything. This was no long-term solution. Meanwhile, German engineering advanced rapidly. As battles on the Eastern Front intensified, the Germans introduced even heavier models. The formidable Tiger tank appeared with thick frontal armor that Allied weapons struggled to penetrate. Later came the Panther, with sloped armor designed to deflect incoming rounds and a powerful cannon capable of destroying Allied tanks from long range. Every improvement widened the gap. German tank crews grew confident. Their machines gave them power that made them feel superior on the battlefield. And as long as infantry could be pushed aside, tanks could roam freely. The United States needed innovation fast. Fortunately, that innovation was already being shaped quietly in American labs. During the late 1930s, military scientists experimented with a new kind of explosive technology, the shaped charge. When properly constructed, this charge focused its explosive energy into a single jet, capable of punching through armor far thicker than a conventional blast could manage. It changed the entire concept of anti-tank weapons. Instead of requiring huge guns or close placement, shaped charges could do the job with smaller warheads. But the shaped charge needed a way to be fired accurately from a safe distance. Engineers explored various delivery methods before settling on an idea that was almost surprisingly simple: a rocket tube. Load a rocket equipped with a shaped charge warhead into a shoulder-mounted launcher, aim, and fire. The user no longer needed a cannon. They became the cannon. By 1942, inventors had developed a workable model: a 2.36-inch, 60 mm, rocket-propelled grenade, powered by an electrically activated motor, launched from a metal tube. A soldier could carry it without difficulty. It weighed little compared to existing anti-tank guns. It required no long setup or complicated preparation. The prototype worked well during testing. It successfully penetrated armor that infantry weapons could not scratch. Generals watched demonstrations with growing excitement. Suddenly, tanks were not invincible. The weapon quickly received an official name: the M1 rocket launcher. But soldiers preferred the nickname that spread across training grounds: bazooka. The term came from a whimsical, homemade musical instrument used by comedian Bob Burns. The resemblance to the long tube-like shape was obvious, and the name stuck permanently. By mid-1942, the U.S. military began shipping the first bazookas overseas. Deployment followed the waves of America's arrival into the global conflict. The earliest real combat use came in North Africa, where U.S. soldiers faced German and Italian armor for the first time on the battlefields of Tunisia. These new weapons were still unfamiliar to troops. Soldiers learned how to aim at weak spots, side armor, rear sections, and tracks. They practiced firing from concealment, popping out only long enough to take the shot. Instructors emphasized patience. Wait until the tank exposed a vulnerable angle, because a frontal shot on a well-armored Panzer might not succeed. Even so, the bazooka gave infantry something they had never possessed before: the psychological ability to fight back. A tank approaching no longer meant certain defeat. Squads built confidence. Tactics changed. Soldiers planned ambush points rather than retreats. German officers soon noticed the shift. Reports from their armored units described unexpected armor breaches from infantry positions. Tanks that once advanced boldly now had to consider threats hidden in trenches, behind rubble, inside forests, and around village corners. Yet, early operations revealed flaws too. Dust and poor weather could affect the rocket's electrical ignition. Range limitations meant soldiers needed to get dangerously close to targets. And armor improvements, especially on newer German tanks in Europe, sometimes defeated the early warheads. But the United States did not stop refining the design. A new, improved version appeared by 1943, the M1, A1 faster to load, safer, and easier to handle. It saw action in the invasion of Sicily, and later in Italy, where close combat in cities and mountains made the bazooka even more valuable. German tanks struggled in narrow streets and tight terrain. The bazooka thrived where tank mobility was restricted, giving infantry dominance in areas once dominated by armor. U.S. commanders noticed a shift in German behavior. Tank units acted more cautiously around infantry. Small enemy teams carried weapons that could end the fight instantly if the tank exposed its side armor. Commanders now asked for close infantry support whenever panzers advanced, something they had previously considered unnecessary against infantry alone. The Germans learned the hard way that mobility and firepower meant nothing if a cheap shoulder-fired rocket could end their mission in one strike. Word spread across the front line. Some German crewmen referred to any bazooka they encountered simply as "that American tube." Tank crews began inspecting battlefields for signs of ambush, anything suspicious, a broken wall, a damaged car, a hole in the earth that might hide a soldier. It was the first time German tankers truly felt hunted by infantry. In response, German engineers attempted improvements. Armored skirts were added to Panzer III and IV tanks, designed to disrupt incoming shaped charges. Additional plating and protective wire mesh appeared, but the problem never fully disappeared. The bazooka remained a threat that could not be ignored. By the time the Allies prepared for the Great Invasion of Normandy, nearly every US infantry squad carried at least one bazooka. Soldiers trusted it. Germans feared it. This weapon, simple, inexpensive, and easy to distribute, had quietly reshaped frontline warfare. A machine that once commanded the battlefield now needed protection from a soldier crawling through hedgerows with a tube and a rocket. And that shift was about to explode into full view in Western Europe, where dense terrain and close urban combat pushed the bazooka into its deadliest chapter yet. This is where the story widens, and where fear inside German steel begins to grow faster than armor thickness could keep up with. The lessons learned in North Africa and Sicily spread quickly through the U.S. Army. The bazooka was no longer an experimental weapon, it was a requirement for survival. Army planners recognized that the next major step in the war would be the largest amphibious invasion in history. To defeat Germany in Europe, the Allies would need to land troops on the French coast and then fight inland through territory packed with German armor. The bazooka would play a key role in making that possible. Before D-Day, tens of thousands of American infantrymen trained with the rocket launcher. They practiced firing from crouched positions, standing positions, and behind cover. They learned how to stalk tanks through hedgerows, how to aim for weak spots, and how to coordinate shots with rifle, grenades, and mines. Bazooka teams formed inside every platoon. Usually, a two-man crew operated the weapon, the gunner who aimed and fired, and the assistant who carried extra rockets, reloaded, and delivered covering fire. But the launcher was simple enough that even one soldier alone could use it if necessary. The power this gave the infantry was more significant than many realized at the time. German tanks still possessed terrifying firepower. Their heavy guns could destroy any Allied vehicle at long distances, but those strengths mattered little if the tank had to operate in terrain where every shadow could hide a bazooka team. Normandy would prove to be exactly that kind of terrain. Meanwhile, development continued back in the United States. Engineers refined the ignition, improved rocket stability, and tested better-shaped charge warheads capable of defeating even heavier armor. The M9 version, introduced before the end of 1943, increased reliability and made production more efficient. Aluminum components replaced some steel parts, reducing weight. Folding launch tubes improved mobility. The bazooka was becoming not just a weapon of necessity, but a weapon of excellence. German battlefield intelligence reports started warning headquarters about this growing threat. They described tanks lost to hits on side armor from hidden infantry. They reported the danger of advancing without constant scouting. A Panzer commander's worst nightmare was emerging: the idea that a cheap American weapon could defeat one of the most sophisticated machines Germany had ever built. Some German crewmen wrote home about the fear they felt entering combat zones where the enemy remained unseen until the rocket fired. Many panzers now advanced with infantry around them, forced into slower movement patterns that reduced their tactical advantage. The battlefield was beginning to shift in favor of those on foot. Despite this progress, the bazooka was still far from perfect in the early years. Range was limited optimally around 30 to 60 meters, depending on the version and conditions. Accuracy diminished quickly at longer distances, and wind could alter the rocket's path. German tanks that engaged from far away still held a clear advantage. Armor improvements also complicated matters. The thick frontal plating on Tiger and Panther tanks could withstand bazooka hits if struck at the wrong angle. Soldiers needed skill, courage, and positioning to use the weapon effectively. But American infantry had learned something crucial. A tank was no longer untouchable, and that knowledge itself changed how battles unfolded. As the Allies prepared for the campaign in northwestern Europe, German industry also raced to improve its armor fleet. The Tiger I, first appearing in late 1942, terrified every Allied force it faced. Its armor could shrug off most common anti-tank rounds. Its 88mm gun was devastating at extreme distances. The Panther, introduced in 1943, added sloped armor and speed that made it equally dangerous. Yet, For all this engineering brilliance, these tanks carried a hidden vulnerability. They were large, they were noisy, they struggled in tight or broken terrain, and they required maintenance and fuel that Germany could barely sustain. A Tiger needed a wide road or clear field to operate effectively. But Europe's hedgerow country was not a field, it was a maze. And in that maze, the bazooka became a hunter. Reports from Italy showed how effective the weapon could be when the terrain forced tanks into narrow paths. American infantry used rooftops, windows, craters, and destroyed vehicles as perfect ambush positions. Tanks that tried to turn quickly or reverse often exposed weaker armor to a waiting bazooka team. The first time a Tiger went up in flames from a shoulder-fired rocket, German crewmen were shocked. Propaganda had told them their tanks were invincible. Reality burned in front of them. German engineers recognized the threat and worked to defend against it. One solution was Schürzen thin metal skirts bolted along the sides of Panzer III and IV tanks. These plates were not thick armor. They were specifically designed to disrupt shaped charge jets before they reached the main hull. In practice, effectiveness varied, but the very existence of such modifications proved one thing clearly. The bazooka had forced Germany to change its tanks. Every armor upgrade meant more weight, less fuel efficiency, and slower production. While Germany struggled to reinforce its existing arsenal, the United States mass-produced thousands more bazookas for its growing armies. By the time Allied forces gathered in southern England for the Normandy invasion, the bazooka was everywhere. Soldiers kept them beside foxholes, strapped to jeeps, and carried them during patrols. Rocket ammunition filled backpacks and satchel bags. Infantry no longer stepped aside to let tanks lead every charge. Tanks, instead, needed infantry to protect them from enemies with rockets. This reversal cut into the heart of German doctrine. The Panzer divisions that had once spearheaded attacks now advanced more cautiously. They did not know which shadow might contain a new weapon built from simple metal and wires, but powerful enough to destroy them instantly. Training manuals changed on both sides. American soldiers drilled with emphasis on ambush tactics. German crews studied how to avoid close-quarters entrapment. Bazooka versus tank had become a duel of nerves. More importantly, the balance of power between machines and men was transforming. No longer did armored steel determine the fate of a battlefield. Human skill and courage, armed with a weapon that cost a fraction of a Panzer, could now end the fight. When the first American troops landed on the beaches of Normandy on the 6th of June 1944, bazookas came with them. They were dragged through the surf, hauled up dunes, and fired at bunkers and strongpoints throughout D-Day. That morning proved the weapon was more than just anti-armor. It could destroy fortified positions too. But it was after the beaches, in the hedgerows of Normandy, where the true test began. Tall, thick earth walls divided French farmland into tight compartments. Tanks could not see into the next field without exposing themselves at the corners. Panzer crews found their lines of advance blocked by obstacles that turned the battlefield into a chessboard of close-range engagements. And hidden in those hedgerows were American soldiers waiting with bazookas. German armored superiority depended on distance and open ground. The bazooka removed both advantages. Soon, every Panzer crew approached a hedgerow with suspicion. They listened for whispers. They searched for glints of metal. They feared the sudden trail of smoke that only needed a moment to appear. The United States had found a weapon that struck directly at German confidence. A tool cheap enough to give to every squad, a weapon light enough to carry anywhere, a rocket simple enough for quick training, a design powerful enough to kill a tank instantly. Now the narrative will shift deeper toward the tactical mastery and psychological effect of the bazooka, and why German tank crews soon began to fear every movement in the corner of their eyes. German tank crews once believed they controlled the battlefield. The arrival of the bazooka changed that belief completely. A weapon so small, carried by a single infantryman, could now stop a machine weighing more than 30 tons. This shift created a new kind of power in the hands of American soldiers, one based not on size, but on precision, surprise, and courage. The bazooka was light enough to sling over a shoulder. Infantrymen often carried extra rockets strapped in pouches or tucked carefully inside haversacks. Soldiers realized quickly that the launcher could be fired from behind walls, fences, haystacks, or even out of upper-story windows. The weapon gave them options tanks never expected. Every ruined building in a French village became a potential ambush point. Every tree line concealed danger. Every street corner hid a chance to fire the rocket that could change the outcome of the battle. Infantry units practiced coordinated attacks using the bazooka as the spear of their assault. One group drew the tank's attention with rifle or machine gun fire. Another crew moved stealthily to the flank. When the tank shifted its turret, even slightly, it exposed weaker armor. The bazooka team fired. A flash, a trail of smoke, a deafening blast, and the enemy's most feared weapon was disabled in seconds. Tactics evolved constantly. In the hedgerows of Normandy, squads crawled through narrow cuts in the earth, close enough to hear German tank engines idling only meters away. They learned to wait for the right moment when the tank slowed at a sharp corner, when the wheels lifted over a shallow ditch, or when the turret aimed the wrong direction. The closer the bazooka operator got, the higher the chance of success. It took bravery few could imagine. The weapon also boosted morale dramatically. Before its introduction, infantry often felt like obstacles to be crushed beneath the weight of steel. With the bazooka, they became hunters again. Soldiers wrote home, describing the confidence it gave them. Some even requested additional rockets, knowing that each one represented a chance to save their unit from destruction. Training for the weapon became central to infantry doctrine. Troops learned how to aim under stress, how to calculate rocket drop over distance, and how to stay completely still until the precise moment to fire. They learned to anticipate the tank commander's decisions, where he would look, when he would turn, how he reacted to infantry fire. The bazooka crew, if skilled, could think like a tank operator. Urban combat magnified the weapon's effectiveness even more. Towns and villages across Europe became lethal traps for tanks. Streets forced armor into narrow lines where maneuverability vanished. Windows high above the road offered clear side shots. Debris in the streets slowed movement. Chimneys, doorways, and rubble all hid soldiers holding rockets ready to fire. German tank commanders began ordering infantry support on every move forward. They refused to enter built-up areas alone. Once fearless, they now feared every alley. The bazooka's intimidation power extended beyond the battlefield. German intelligence units tracked reports of new American anti-tank rockets continuously. They noted that the weapon required minimal industrial effort to produce sheets of simple steel tube, electrical triggers, and shaped charge explosives that factories could assemble rapidly. For every expensive German tank, America could equip hundreds of soldiers with the ability to destroy it. This was a terrifying imbalance. Even with engineering improvements such as Schürzen armored skirts and enhanced hull welding, German tanks remained vulnerable. The added armor helped against glancing shots and early bazooka warheads, but did not eliminate the threat. Tankers still felt exposed from the sides and rear. They placed sandbags and logs along the hull in desperation. Some even welded extra plates scavenged from wrecks. These modifications made tanks heavier, engines strained, tracks wore down, maneuverability suffered. And none of it fully solved the core problem. Infantry now had a weapon that tanks could not afford to ignore. The bazooka also introduced an entirely new form of psychological warfare. Before its arrival, German tank crews advanced aggressively, confident that infantry posed little danger. After they witnessed tanks erupt from shoulder-fired rockets, every movement became cautious. Tankers rode with open hatches more often, scanning for ambushes, but that exposed them to rifle fire and shrapnel. Closing the hatches protected them, but robbed them of awareness. Either choice increased their vulnerability. Fear slowed the German advance more than any barricade. American commanders recognized this fear and exploited it. They deployed bazooka teams in clusters, forming dedicated tank hunter squads. These teams executed ambushes with incredible precision, often disabling multiple armored vehicles in minutes. Once the first rocket struck home, panic rippled through the German formation. Tanks turned blindly, reversed into ditches, collided with walls, or fired wildly at shadows. Infantry, who once scattered at the sight of armor, now pressed forward to finish the job. Even German propaganda failed to hide the danger. German soldiers wrote letters home warning families about the weapon that attacked from nowhere. Tank commanders briefed their crews before every operation. Avoid roads near forests, buildings, or rubble. Stay clear of narrow lanes. Never expose your flanks. But on the European battlefield, avoiding danger was impossible. In Italy, steep mountains and winding streets amplified threat. In France, hedgerows turned every field into a trap. In Belgium and the Netherlands, rivers, canals, and destroyed towns created complex fighting zones where the bazooka thrived. Wherever a tank needed to pass tightly or slowly, the weapon waited. The bazooka's accessibility made it even more effective. Soldiers learned quickly how to use it, and many carried extra rockets beside their regular equipment. If the gunner fell, the assistant stepped forward instantly. If both fell, another man dropped his rifle and lifted the launcher. German tankers never knew how many bazookas they faced at one time. A cheap, mass-produced weapon turned the battlefield into uncertainty for the most advanced machines Germany built. Each rocket cost only a tiny fraction of a tank. A single hit could destroy months of manufacturing effort and the lives of a trained crew. German officers hated that equation. They believed warfare should favor the strongest machines, the most powerful engineering, the greatest firepower. But the bazooka ignored that belief. It punished overconfidence. American soldiers who once feared tanks felt empowered. They wrote in journals of how good it felt to level the playing field. Their training gave them technique, but their courage turned technique into results. A bazooka operator who struck a moving tank under fire displayed the kind of bravery that defined frontline heroism. This was the first time in history that nearly every infantry squad in a major army carried a weapon designed to kill the most dangerous machines on the ground. The battlefield changed forever. The bazooka's impact reached beyond tactics. It changed how war was understood. The lesson was simple. Give ordinary soldiers the means to defeat extraordinary weapons, and power shifts instantly. German tank crews began to dread terrain where infantry could hide. They stayed in open ground whenever possible. They requested artillery support just to move forward a few hundred meters. They approached villages like hunters walking into a dark cave. The bazooka cost them time. It cost them speed. It cost them the psychological advantage tanks once guaranteed. The enemy's fear grew not from what the weapon looked like, but from what it could do silently, quickly, from distances too close for tanks to react. A German Panzer commander once described the experience bluntly. The battlefield became full of ghosts with rockets. This was not poetic exaggeration. To them, the rocket attacks truly felt like phantoms, invisible until the smoke trail, deadly before anyone could respond. The next section will reveal how deeply this weapon changed German armored tactics, why tank crews adapted their entire behavior around a single, cheap American launcher, and how that fear grew when terrain turned against them during the toughest battles of the war. German armored doctrine had been built on confidence. Tanks were the spearhead, the unstoppable core of blitzkrieg. Forces. Everything tanks relied on began to feel uncertain. Speed was no longer safe. Advancing alone was suicide. Even victory felt fragile if a single infantryman could fire the rocket that ended the mission. Tank crews developed habits that showed their fear. They avoided tight corners where they could not rotate the turret quickly. They hesitated at tree lines. They crossed bridges at full speed, terrified that a rocket would streak out from the shadows. Every ruined building made them nervous. The battlefield had turned hostile to steel. American infantry understood this fear and multiplied it with tactics that evolved daily. Bazooka operator teams learned to move silently through hedges, alleys, and narrow gaps. They studied the engine sounds of different German tanks, the deep rumble of a Tiger, the sharper growl of a Panzer IV. They learned to fire at moments when the tank struggled to maneuver, such as while turning or climbing obstacles. Many teams became experts not only in hitting tanks but in outthinking them. They learned that German commanders often reversed when they sensed danger, so they set up ambushes aimed at that instinct, firing first from one side, then hitting the exposed rear armor as the tank backed away into the second position. Coordination like this meant that a single concealed bazooka crew could destroy multiple tanks in a single engagement. German commanders now planned around the weapon. Before entering villages, infantry scouts went ahead to check windows, basements, and rubble piles. Tanks avoided leading attacks, instead waiting until foot soldiers secured paths. What once had been bold armor thrusts became slow, methodical crawls. Every delay benefited the Allies. The bazooka reshaped German tactics even in open fields. Tanks deployed screens of infantry on both flanks, wasting manpower in protective roles instead of aggressive missions. Tanks fired blind into suspected ambush points, revealing their own positions without achieving anything. The threat of a cheap rocket forced elite machines into defensive behavior. Night operations became especially dangerous. Bazooka crews loved the darkness. The rocket's visible smoke trail mattered less when the tank could not identify where it came from. Tanks had to guess which shadow held the danger. They often guessed wrong. In some operations, German commanders tried using flame weapons to clear hedgerows suspected of hiding bazooka teams. But this desperation only slowed progress further and consumed precious fuel, one of Germany's greatest weaknesses as the war dragged on. Infantry without anti-tank training gained it quickly in the heat of battle. Soldiers who had never seen a tank before D-Day were suddenly destroying them. Some bazooka operators became legends within their units, men who crawled through explosions and gunfire to get within firing distance of giants of steel. Medals awarded for tank kills skyrocketed. German morale inside armored crews shifted dramatically. Early in the war, they entered combat with confidence and pride. Now, every mission carried tension that never left their minds. They had to trust infantry to protect them. They had to trust luck when moving through unfamiliar terrain. And they had to wonder every second whether a hidden rocket waited to strike their weakest point. Many crews preferred to bail out at the first sign of fire rather than risk burning alive. Bazooka hits turned interior spaces into furnaces instantly. Inside a tank, temperatures could rise so fast that survival was a matter of seconds. Even without a catastrophic hit, superheated fragments ricocheting inside the turret left no room for hesitation. Fear became a weapon sharper than steel. German tank commanders began refusing orders to attack through towns without proper support. They requested air cover or artillery preparation before moving forward. These delays allowed American forces to reinforce positions, fortify choke points, and plan more ambushes. The bazooka was never meant to control territory, but it controlled momentum. The German response expanded beyond small modifications. Engineers worked urgently on heavy defensive screens, creative armor arrangements, and counter-infantry tactics. They rushed to deploy more armored reconnaissance vehicles and half-tracks to screen Panzer advances. But the supply chain struggled. Fuel shortages and bombing raids on German factories slowed production. Tank crews often fought in older or poorly repaired vehicles. The bazooka did not just destroy tanks, it disrupted an entire system. Every time a tank sat still to avoid exposing weak armor, it was not helping its infantry. Every time a tank called for support to move, it delayed operations. Every time a tank turned away from a suspicious shadow, the battlefield bent in America's favor. Some German units attempted countermeasures that directly targeted bazooka crews. Snipers were placed to watch suspected ambush positions. Machine gun fire raked hedgerows before tanks advanced. Tanks sometimes rotated turrets continuously just to keep infantry under cover. But none of these tactics restored the decisive, overwhelming power the Panzers once held. In fact, they revealed how much fear the weapon had injected into German strategy. For a weapon so simple, its effect was complex and devastating. It forced Germany to fight a different war than the one they wanted. Tanks had been designed to break lines, smash defenses, and advance quickly toward objectives. Instead, they crawled cautiously through territory they once dominated without effort. This new fear reached its highest intensity when combined with terrain designed by nature to trap tanks places like the French Bocage country. The bazooka turned that terrain into a nightmare. German tank crews reported feeling blind, boxed in by dense walls of earth and vegetation. They heard movement but could not fire accurately into hedges without wasting ammunition. They watched for muzzle flashes but often saw the rocket only after the shot, and by then it was too late. Even when tanks knocked out one bazooka team, another was often nearby. The weapon was everywhere in ditches, behind walls, inside barns, under bridges. The battlefield had become a labyrinth designed to feed steel monsters into the jaws of small, fearless teams armed with rockets. The weapon also spread rapidly among Allied armies. The British and Canadians used it. Free Polish and Free French troops used it. Even resistance groups behind German lines eventually acquired captured bazookas and fired them in ambushes. Every tank crew feared encountering it, no matter the flag of the soldiers they fought. The psychological shift became permanent. From 1943 onward, no German commander planned an attack without first asking, "Where are the enemy bazooka teams?" This question never had a reliable answer. Fear turned into hesitation. Hesitation slowed operations. Slower operations lost battles. For the first time in warfare, infantry wielded a weapon that forced tanks into a supporting role rather than the spearhead. This reversal stunned Germany. Their doctrine of quick armoured thrusts, the very heart of blitzkrieg, now failed in the face of a simple, cheap launcher. Bazookas allowed Allied infantry to fight German armour on equal terms, and in many close battles, on better terms. Soon came the hardest battles Germany would fight in the West, where every Panzer that advanced risked being the next one to erupt into flame. In Normandy's fields and later in the frozen forests of Belgium, the war between Bazooka and Panzer reached its most intense and decisive confrontations. Tank crews once believed that armour protected them from fear. Now they learned that fear could slip through armour like a rocket through steel. The turning point in this struggle was coming, where the bazooka would prove that even the most feared tanks in the world could not escape a determined infantryman with a rocket and a clear shot. Normandy was the place where the bazooka would prove its full power. After the landings on D-Day, American soldiers pushed inland into a countryside unlike anything armoured warfare had faced before. Dense hedgerows bordered every field, thick earth banks covered in bushes and trees, forming walls sometimes higher than a man's head. Tanks could not see beyond the next enclosure. Every turn risked exposing their sides to weapons they could not detect in time. German tank crews soon realized they were fighting in a place where the enemy controlled the sightlines. American infantry disappeared into hedges, foxholes, and sunken lanes. The bazooka operators could lie low, wait silently, and strike with perfect timing. Tanks that entered a field did so blind. They could only react after a rocket streaked out of a green wall and slammed into steel. These ambushes were not accidents. American forces developed a new tactic built specifically for this terrain: the hedgerow team. One group would distract the tank with rifle fire to make the commander button up, reducing visibility. Meanwhile, a bazooka team crawled around the hedgerow, finding the flank. When they opened fire, the rocket often hit before the tank even realized it had been targeted. Close combat tank casualties began rising sharply. German commanders who had once driven forward confidently now hesitated at every intersection of hedges. Tanks were forced to stop and fire into the bushes ahead, but this only revealed their location. American spotters watched carefully. The flash of a cannon was the perfect signal for a bazooka operator to aim. The German High Command noticed the pattern immediately. Reports poured in describing tanks destroyed at shockingly close range. Crews described hearing the rockets launch only moments before death. Some witnessed tanks erupt violently after a single hit, ammunition cooking off in seconds. Panzer commanders now understood that armour thickness was no longer protection. Their biggest weakness had always been their sides and rear, and the bazooka targeted exactly those spots. The fear intensified further when American paratroopers, cut off behind enemy lines, used bazookas with remarkable skill. On June 6 and 7, 1944, isolated airborne companies prevented German tanks from breaking into beachhead positions. Small groups of paratroopers hidden in farm lanes knocked out tanks that tried to exploit gaps. The German expectation that tanks could roll over light infantry collapsed almost immediately. In urban areas like Carentan, Saint-Lô, and Cherbourg, the story was even worse for the Germans. Cities turned into killing grounds for tanks. Streets were too narrow for maneuvering. Every tall building became a vantage point for a bazooka operator. A panzer that tried to turn around often exposed its rear armour to a rooftop launcher. One hit, one fireball, one tank gone. The psychological effect was enormous. German officers warned tank crews constantly, never go anywhere alone, never trust a quiet street, never assume infantry is unarmed. But even with infantry support, tanks were dying. German foot soldiers feared moving ahead of armor under heavy American fire. Coordination broke down. Armor halted. And when armor halted, momentum died. The story repeated everywhere. A Panther rolls forward. A hedgerow conceals a bazooka team. A single rocket ends the advance. Panthers and Tigers were terrifying machines, but only if they could shoot first. The bazooka robbed them of that luxury. American soldiers gained confidence with each success. They took risks that seemed unthinkable a year earlier, sprinting between hedgerows under fire to get close enough for a shot. Some accounts describe soldiers letting tanks pass over them in ditches, firing at the exposed rear as soon as the vehicle moved past. Extreme courage paired with a simple weapon turned ordinary infantrymen into tank killers. As the breakout from Normandy accelerated, especially during Operation Cobra, German armored units could not stop the advancing Americans. Every attempt at a counterattack resulted in burned-out tanks lining the fields. The Germans began losing not just machines, but experienced crews, men who had survived years of battle on the Eastern Front, now dying to a weapon that cost less than a tank's spare track links. Panic grew in armored formations. Tank destroyers and assault guns tried to replace losses, but they too suffered under the same threat. Some crews began welding scrap metal onto vulnerable areas. Others carried extra infantry on the hull to watch for ambushes. But this exposed more lives to danger and still did not solve the core problem. The worst moment for Germany came when their prized heavy tanks, the Tiger and Panther, were lost to weapons they once believed were too weak to matter. Seeing tanks worth enormous resources destroyed by a lone soldier with a shoulder-fired rocket drained morale faster than any strategic setback. The Battle of Normandy marked a turning point. Tanks could no longer dictate the fight. They fought defensively, reacting instead of leading, and then the Allies pushed into Belgium. The terrain shifted again from hedgerows to dense forests and freezing villages, setting the stage for the most desperate German armoured offensive of the war. The name of that offensive is remembered worldwide, the Battle of the Bulge. There, in snow-covered woods and ruined towns, American bazooka teams would again face German panzers in brutal, close-quarters engagements. German tank crews expected the winter and surprise to restore their dominance. Instead, the same fear followed them into the forest. Tanks rolled forward. Smoke from winter fires drifted between the trees. Snow muffled their tracks, but unseen eyes watched from every shadow. Bazooka teams waited behind logs and frozen stone walls. A German commander might feel safe until a rocket flashed white against the snow and slammed into his tank, sending the crew scrambling to escape flames in sub-zero temperatures. In the Bulge, both sides fought desperately, but only one side had a weapon that turned every rifle squad into a tank-killing threat. The battle was far from over. The war's final confrontation between steel and rocket was growing fiercer, and German tank crews were running out of time, fuel, and hope. Snow fell heavily in the Ardennes forest. Visibility dropped. Engines struggled in the cold air. German panzer divisions pushed through the trees in their last major effort to change the course of the war. Hitler called it his final gamble, the attack that would split the Allied lines, retake Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. German tank crews believed surprise would give them back the advantage they once dominated. The thick forest concealed their approach. American units, scattered and exhausted from months of non-stop fighting, reeled backward under the initial assault. Panic spread through the snow-covered trenches as massive Panthers and Tigers appeared again on the Western Front. But the Germans encountered something they did not expect. Everywhere they went, rockets waited in silence. American soldiers might have been cold, tired, and low on artillery support, but they still carried bazookas. Even isolated units could stand against tanks with the weapon that had already changed the war in France. Forest trails forced German armour into narrow paths like Normandy hedgerows had months earlier. Tanks struggled to turn. Turrets caught on trees. Exhaust fumes choked visibility. The perfect environment for an ambush. Bazooka teams manoeuvred behind snowbanks and abandoned farm buildings. They crept through thick woods that muffled every movement. When a tank advanced blindly around a bend or over a crest, its flanks appeared just long enough for a shot, a flash of smoke, a blast, steel hit by shaped charge fire, crew scrambling out into freezing air. German tank commanders found themselves fighting ghosts again. They could not send infantry ahead because American riflemen held defensive lines with fierce determination. They could not rush forward because a rocket team always seemed ready at the next turn. The panic inside German armor was real. The battlefield was filled with sudden lightning strikes from bazookas, hidden so close that tank gunners rarely had time to aim a response. In towns like Streetvith, Clairvaux, and Bastogne, the problem intensified. Urban streets forced tanks onto predictable routes. American soldiers crouched in basements, behind stone walls, or inside blown-out windows. When tanks appeared, they aimed at the vulnerable lower hull plates or treads, disabling a machine costing hundreds of thousands of Reichsmarks with a rocket that cost a tiny fraction of that amount. German crews knew what happened next if their tank stopped moving. More rockets, flames, ammunition cooking off. Survival measured in seconds. Some German tanks advanced with flamethrowers in support, hoping to burn ambush positions. But fire could not clear every room. Rockets still found their mark. Even when German tanks managed to break through a sector, they did so at severe cost. Supply lines lagged. Vehicles abandoned due to fuel shortages became targets. Panthers ran dry and were captured or destroyed by infantry, who once would have been helpless against such machines. The deeper the Panzers tried to push, the more the forest seemed filled with invisible hunters. One of the most famous stands of the battle, Bastogne, demonstrated exactly how the bazooka changed everything. American paratroopers surrounded in that town held on against repeated tank assaults. They used narrow streets and broken buildings to position themselves for point-blank shots. German tanks burned on the outskirts, halted by defenders who refused to give up. Tank crews tried new tactics. Rapid directional changes, crewmen scanning with pistols from hatches, infantry running alongside armor despite the risk. But none restored their confidence. Their armor felt thinner every time they heard the explosive crack of a bazooka rocket firing. As German losses mounted, momentum collapsed. The offensive slowed until it stopped completely. The last hope for a German armoured victory in the West died in that winter forest. The Panzer's fear followed them into every battle afterward. When Allied forces crossed the Rhine and entered Germany itself, the fight entered cities and industrial zones, the worst environments possible for tanks. Urban combat is the domain of infantry. Streets become kill zones. Windows become firing positions. Tanks lose their advantage of distance and speed. In Cologne, in the Ruhr, in countless towns beaten down by years of war, Panzer wrecks lined the roads. Some were destroyed by artillery. Many fell to airstrikes, but a shocking number bore the distinct piercing wounds of infantry-fired shaped charges. Bazookas and other Allied anti-tank rockets were everywhere. German crews were trapped inside armor that once represented pride, now a burden that attracted fire from every direction. Their machines had become tombs waiting to be sealed. They entered combat with the dread that a mistake 1 corner too tight or 1 second too slow would mean fire and steel tearing through the compartments around them. Tank gunners struggled to keep their composure. Commanders had to fight the instinct to reverse constantly. Even elite Tiger crews, hardened by years of combat, confessed after the war that the bazooka was one of the most feared threats they encountered. Not because it was powerful, but because it was everywhere. It turned the battlefield into equal ground. It erased the privilege tanks once enjoyed. It forced strategy to change. It forced morale to break. And it forced Germany to realize that armored supremacy had ended not through engineering or artillery, but through a simple weapon placed in ordinary hands. By the war's final months, German tank units faced impossible decisions. Do they attack and risk rocket ambushes? Do they stay defensive and get bypassed? Every choice led to another loss. Many crews abandoned their tanks voluntarily if they believed a bazooka team lay ahead. They would rather run than burn. The bazooka did not win the war alone, but it ensured that tanks could not win it for Germany. It ensured that armoured strikes failed. It ensured that infantry no longer fell back in terror. This was the ultimate turning point. Tanks, once the hunters, became the hunted. The German Armored Corps, the pride of the Wehrmacht, was no longer dictating the fight. It was reacting desperately to a cheap launcher that America produced faster than Germany could replace destroyed Panzers. The roar of tank engines still echoed, but beneath every roar lurked a whisper of danger, a danger small enough to carry on a shoulder, but powerful enough to destroy a kingdom of steel. The war moved rapidly toward conclusion after the failed German offensive in the Ardennes. The armored power that once conquered entire nations now retreated through towns it had destroyed on the way east. German tank crews faced a cruel reality. Their greatest threat no longer came from enemy tanks or artillery. It came from the smallest and cheapest weapon on the battlefield that could fit into a foxhole, every burned-out Panther lying in the snow, every abandoned Tiger blocking a village road, every Panzer IV wrecked in a hedgerow ditch. Many owed their destruction to rockets fired by infantry who refused to surrender ground. German commanders recorded the change in tone clearly. In one report from late 1944, an officer wrote that Allied tank hunter units were everywhere, always invisible until it was too late. Another complained that tanks cannot operate without full infantry screens because the enemy carries shoulder, weapons able to defeat even heavy armor. Exaggerations. They were admissions of fear. The economic imbalance behind this shift made the situation hopeless. Germany poured enormous resources into building a single Tiger tank, skilled labor, scarce metals, precision machinery, and thousands of man-hours. America, by comparison, could distribute hundreds of bazookas for a fraction of that cost, and most soldiers learned how to fire them in a single afternoon. The battlefield became a place where the most expensive weapon could be destroyed by the least expensive. No German tank builder could match that equation. No strategy could reverse it. Captured German crewmen later confessed that the sound of a bazooka rocket haunted them more than the thunder of artillery. The first sign of attack was usually the last, a blast, a burst of flame, and smoke leaking from every seam of the tank. Those who survived stumbled out into chaos, blinded and burned, with only seconds to escape before ammunition detonated. In the final invasions of Germany in 1945, the weapon continued its legacy. American infantry used bazookas to break through defensive lines, destroy pillboxes, and eliminate armored roadblocks. What began as a tool to defeat steel became a universal solution for frontline problem-solving. Germany's surrender in May 1945 confirmed what frontline tankers already knew. Armor alone could not win wars anymore. A weapon that weighed almost nothing compared to a tank had helped erase the dominance of armored vehicles that once reshaped Europe. The most advanced Panzers ever produced late-war models like the Tiger II arrived too late to matter. They were massive, slow, and stuck in cities where bazooka teams waited above and behind them. Technological brilliance could not overcome a battlefield that rewarded simplicity and speed. The anti-tank rocket had broken the psychological advantage Germany's armor once enjoyed. It handed that advantage to U.S. infantry instead. And as peace approached, armies worldwide studied the lesson written clearly across Europe. A single soldier with the right weapon can decide the fate of a tank and the fate of a war. The story now continues into the long-term result, how the bazooka shaped future weapon design and became the ancestor of nearly every modern infantry anti-armor system used around the world. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the lessons of the bazooka did not disappear. Every nation that studied the war recognized that armored dominance could be shattered by the smallest and cheapest weapon in the hands of infantry. The idea that tanks ruled the battlefield alone had died somewhere in the hedgerows of Normandy and the forests of the Ardennes. The bazooka became the foundation for a completely new generation of weapons. Captured examples were rushed into examination rooms in Moscow and Berlin. Soviet engineers studied the launcher closely. They admired the simplicity, the ease of use, and the shaped charge warhead. Not long after the war, the Soviet Union produced its own version, the famous RPG-2, grandfather of the RPG-7, the most widely used anti-armor weapon in modern history. Its lineage can be traced directly back to the American bazooka. Other countries followed. France, Britain, China, and dozens of developing nations built their own shoulder-fired anti-tank launchers. The concept spread globally. Lightweight rockets, cheap to make, easy to carry, deadly against armor. Guerrilla fighters and resistance groups soon used these weapons with the same confidence American soldiers once had. The bazooka changed not just technology, it changed strategy. Tanks had to evolve. Designers improved armor layout, added explosive reactive plates, and strengthened turret rings and ammunition compartments. Tanks that had once relied solely on thick steel now needed active protection and better awareness systems to survive infantry ambushes. Modern armies developed new doctrines. Tanks and infantry must operate together, each protecting the other. No armored spearhead moves without boots on the ground, clearing the way. No tank commander advances without knowing someone is watching the flanks. That shift in thinking, forced by a simple American tube, remains a fundamental rule of warfare today. The bazooka also altered how soldiers viewed themselves. Before its arrival, infantry often felt secondary to armor and artillery. After its arrival, they knew they could hold the line against any threat. With the right weapon and the right timing, one brave soldier could destroy a symbol of enemy power. That psychological transformation was as important as any technological advancement. In the decades after World War II, newer versions replaced the original M1 and M9 models. The U.S. introduced the M20 Super Bazooka, more powerful and designed to defeat newer tanks with thicker armor. It served in Korea, where American troops once again found themselves face-to-face with enemy armor in rugged terrain. It later saw action early in Vietnam, before newer guided weapons took its place. But the first bazooka, the one carried ashore on D-Day, the one that stalked panzers through hedgerows, had already secured its place in history. Today, surviving bazookas sit quietly in museums and military collections. They are not graceful like aircraft. They are not impressive like battleships. They are not monuments of complex engineering. They are simply tubes, steel cylinders with wiring, sights, and handles attached. But when veterans walk past them, many stop and stare. They remember how a weapon so ordinary-looking could change the fate of thousands in a single moment. They remember how it gave infantry a fighting chance. They remember how it helped end a war that once seemed unending. The greatest legacy of the bazooka is not in steel or explosions. It is in the belief it created that no soldier is powerless when armed with a tool designed to give them control over their destiny. Because in World War II, this cheap little tube did something extraordinary. It took fear out of the hands of tanks and put power into the hands of ordinary men. The stage is now set for the final reflection, the emotional and historical meaning of this weapon in the greater story of humanity and war. War is often remembered through the machines that dominate it. The thunder of cannons, the roar of engines, the silhouettes of tanks cresting hills. But sometimes, the most important change comes from a weapon that does not intimidate by its size, a weapon that looks almost humble in the hands of a soldier who refuses to step aside. The bazooka was never meant to be heroic. It was born from urgency, an answer to a problem that threatened to crush every hope of victory. Tanks controlled the battlefield, and infantry were dying in front of them with useless rifles and grenades that bounced off steel. Something had to change. Something had to give them a chance. It arrived as a simple tube and a rocket powered by a shaped charge. No elegance, no complexity, just raw purpose. What made it extraordinary was not its design alone, but what that design represented: a shift in the balance of fear. For the first time, an infantryman standing his ground could look at a tank and say, "You should be afraid of me." That quiet sentence echoed across Europe, carried in every rocket trail that pierced armor. The bazooka did not just kill machines, it killed the myth of invincibility surrounding them. German Panzer crews learned that their fortress of steel had weaknesses, and those weaknesses fit perfectly inside a soldier's firing sights. The best proof of a weapon's effectiveness is not in the metal it destroys, but in the behavior it changes. German tanks slowed down. They avoided roads. They refused to enter towns alone. They moved only where infantry screened them. They fired at shadows. They fought with caution instead of confidence, because the fear of a single soldier and his rocket outweighed the strength of 50 tons of steel. That shift did more than win battles. It helped redefine war. It reminded the world that technology does not belong only to the powerful. Innovation that protects the vulnerable can become the most powerful force of all. Behind every bazooka that fired was a pair of shaking hands, a heart pounding harder than the engine in a Tiger tank, a soldier forced to wait until the armored giant turned just enough for a chance, a moment measured in breath and courage. Victory was forged, not in factories alone, but in those seconds when a soldier decided not to run. The bazooka empowered the individual in a way that historians still grapple with today. It took war away from the idea that only the biggest machines could determine history. It placed that responsibility and opportunity back into the hands of those on the ground. It also left a legacy that continues long after the last Panzer burned out under a European sky. Every RPG that streaks across modern battlefields is a descendant of that first American rocket launcher. Every armored vehicle designed today begins with the question, how do we defend against infantry who can destroy us up close? That question exists because of a cheap tube invented in World War II. The bazooka saved countless lives by giving American infantry what they needed most: belief. The belief that no enemy was unstoppable. That courage paired with the right tool could change the entire direction of a war. That armor was no longer a death sentence. If you walk past a bazooka today in a museum, you might not feel impressed at first. It doesn't tower overhead. It doesn't gleam with engineering complexity. But it represents something that deserves a monument. The moment the common soldier became powerful enough to topple the greatest weapon of his time, war will always innovate. Machines will always grow stronger. But so long as a soldier can lift a weapon that gives him a fighting chance, the battlefield will never belong solely to steel. Because once in the fields and forests of Europe, ordinary men with a simple rocket launcher made the most terrifying armored force in the world afraid of them. And that changed history forever.